A man changes his Wi-Fi password and his neighbor calls 911 on him. But when the police arrive, they uncover something far more disturbing. Darius Coleman was not the type of person who sought attention or craved social interaction. He worked from home, maintained a pristine yard, and communicated with his neighbors only when absolutely necessary. In his world, being left alone was ideal, and that was precisely how he liked it. However, one seemingly simple decision thrust him into the center of an investigation that no one could have anticipated. It all began on a quiet Thursday afternoon in Crestwood, Missouri. After an exhausting morning of work, Darius decided to take a much-needed break by checking his internet speed. Recently, his Wi-Fi connection had been acting strangely, buffering during video calls, lagging while streaming his favorite music, and he initially attributed these issues to a faulty service provider. Yet, something about the sluggish performance did not sit right with him. His curiosity led him to explore further. Sitting in his driveway for a stronger signal, Darius leaned against the side of his house while he accessed his router settings on his phone. As he scrolled through the connected devices, his eyes were drawn to one entry that did not belong. It wasn't a random string of numbers or letters. Rather, it appeared as though someone had intentionally named it Crestwood I-1. That struck him as odd. After all, Darius lived alone. He had only his phone, his laptop, and his television connected to his network. He was not the type to share his password or allow other devices on his connection. So, who was using his internet? Annoyed and perplexed, Darius decided to take action. He removed every unknown device from his network and promptly reset his Wi-Fi password. As he typed in the new credentials, he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. It was at that precise moment that Melanie Foster, a neighbor with a penchant for suspicion, caught sight of him. From the window of her kitchen, she observed Darius standing in his driveway, intensely focused on his phone as his fingers moved quickly across the screen. To Melanie, the scene looked highly suspicious. Melanie had never really trusted Darius, not because of any overt misdeeds, but simply because he had always kept to himself. He rarely attended neighborhood gatherings, seldom exchanged pleasantries, and appeared to be perpetually aloof. In her eyes, his solitary lifestyle was a sign of someone who preferred secrecy. And now, here he was, standing outside and fiddling with his phone in a manner that set off alarm bells in her mind. Immediately, her imagination raced. The worst-case scenario took shape. Perhaps Darius was engaged in some form of hacking. Although she did not know exactly what he might be up to or why, her gut instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. Without taking time to reconsider her thoughts, Melanie grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious," she told the dispatcher. "My neighbor is outside doing something strange with his phone. I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't look right. Can you please send someone to check it out?" Although the dispatcher asked a few questions, Melanie was unable to provide any concrete answers. All she had was her overwhelming sense that something was off. Repeating her concern over and over, she insisted that he was up to something nefarious. Meanwhile, Darius was completely unaware that his quiet afternoon was about to be transformed into a full-blown investigation. He had just finished updating his Wi-Fi password when the sound of sirens reached his ears. At first, he paid little attention, assuming that the police might be heading elsewhere. However, his indifference quickly turned to apprehension when he saw a squad car slow down and come to a stop right in front of his house. Two officers exited the vehicle. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharply defined features, Detective Lewis Nah, while his partner, Officer Bell Carter, had a more compact build but carried an air of quiet authority. Darius exhaled slowly, a resigned acknowledgement that things were about to escalate. As the officers approached, Detective Nah's hand rested near his belt, not in a threatening manner but close enough to serve as a subtle warning. "Sir," Detective Nah called out in a steady voice, "we received a call regarding some suspicious activity. Can you explain what you're doing?" Darius frowned, glancing between the two officers. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated, his tone tinged with both confusion and a desire to maintain calm. "I'm simply changing my Wi-Fi password in my own driveway." His voice was steady, despite the fact that he knew these situations could sometimes spiral out of control. Detective Nah exchanged a brief, knowing glance with Officer Carter before addressing Darius again. "Do you live here?" he inquired. Darius almost laughed at the suggestion. "What kind of question is that?" he replied, gesturing toward the car parked in his driveway and pointing at his mailbox, which clearly bore his name. "I've lived here for 3 years," he said firmly. Before Detective Nahr could respond further, a voice cut through the mounting tension. It was Melanie Foster, standing on her porch, with her arms folded, watching the entire scene unfold as though she were the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood security. "He's lying," she interjected. "I saw him outside, messing with his phone, and I know he's up to something. He always seems to be doing something odd, always outside, tapping away on his phone for at least 10 minutes at a time." Darius could hardly believe that Melanie had chosen this moment to intrude. "I was just on my router settings," he said flatly. "I noticed that someone I don't recognize had been using my Wi-Fi." Melanie scoffed dismissively. "Oh, sure. And you expect me to believe that?" Detective Nahr turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that Mr. Coleman has done something illegal?" he asked, his tone measured. Melanie hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the question. I don't have any evidence," she admitted. "I just have a bad feeling. I just think you should check on him." Detective Nahr's patience began to thin. "Sir, would you mind if we took a quick look at your router settings to clear this up?" he requested, his voice firm. Darius clenched his jaw. Although he resented having to prove his innocence, he also recognized the potential danger of the situation spiraling further out of control. "Fine," he muttered, unlocking his phone and pulling up the settings. "Take a look." Detective Nahr leaned in, his eyes scanning the list of connected devices. That's when his expression changed from one of routine curiosity to genuine concern. There, clearly labeled among the devices, was Crestwood I-1. "Who owns this device?" Detective Nahr asked. Darius shook his head emphatically. "Not me," he replied. Officer Carter interjected, raising her eyebrows. "So someone has been using your Wi-Fi without permission?" Darius nodded slowly. "Yes, and I don't believe they were just stealing my internet. Look at the connection logs. It's been running non-stop. It appears someone has been watching." At that moment, Detective Nahr's posture shifted noticeably. What had started as a mundane neighborhood squabble was now evolving into something far more serious. "Watching?" Melanie asked suddenly, her tone tinged with both confusion and fear. Darius turned toward her, his eyes hardening. "Yes. I mean, someone has been spying on my security system, and they might be watching all of us." A heavy silence fell over the front yard as the weight of his words sank in. Melanie, who had been so convinced she was in the right, now appeared uncertain. The idea of someone spying did not match her preconceived notions. Detective Nahr cleared his throat, his voice now more serious. "All right," he said. "Let's come inside. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with." Reluctantly, Darius led the officers into his house. His frustration simmered just below the surface. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, treated like a suspect in his own home. Melanie followed hesitantly, unsure of what might unfold next, but feeling compelled to witness the truth firsthand. Inside, Darius placed his phone on the dining table and connected it to his laptop so that the router settings would be mirrored on the larger screen. The device list reappeared there, and once again the mysterious Crestwood I-1 was clearly visible. Still connected, still active. Officer Carter leaned in to examine the device this is. "Can you tell what type of device this is?" she asked. Darius clicked around on the screen, his fingers moving rapidly as he navigated through the settings. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. He then opened the activity logs and paused, his face draining of color. "It's been accessing my camera feeds," he said, his voice trembling as the realization hit him. The room fell deathly silent. Melanie blinked in disbelief. I don't understand. Camera feeds?" she stammered. Darius turned the laptop screen toward her. "Yes, my home security cameras. Someone has been logging in and watching my live feeds," he explained. Officer Carter's expression grew more serious. "You're saying that someone has been spying on you through your own security system?" she asked, her tone incredulous. Darius exhaled sharply. "That's exactly what I'm saying." However, as he scrolled further through the logs, his stomach dropped. He discovered that it wasn't only his cameras that had been compromised. The system had flagged multiple IP addresses. Some of these addresses belonged to devices on his network, but others were linked to entirely different homes. "Oh, this is bad," Darius murmured. Detective Nahr leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked urgently. Darius tapped on the screen once more. "Whoever is responsible isn't just watching me. They're watching other people in the neighborhood as well." Melanie took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. No, that can't be right," she whispered. Darius turned toward her, his voice growing colder. "Are you sure about that?" he pressed. With another click, a new log opened on the screen. The feed revealed a dimly lit hallway, followed by images of a living room and then a bedroom. Melanie gasped. "Wait, that's..." she began, and without needing further explanation, she recognized the images immediately. The camera feed was from her own house. In shock, she stumbled backward and pressed her hand to her mouth. Detective Nahr's voice broke through the silence. "How on earth is this happening?" he demanded sharply. Darius gritted his teeth. "If I had to guess, someone in the neighborhood set up a fake network, a Wi-Fi signal that appears perfectly normal. People unknowingly connect to it, and once they do, their devices are compromised." Officer Carter's face darkened with realization. "You mean this is a man-in-the-middle attack?" she asked. Darius nodded emphatically. "Exactly. That's precisely what it is," he confirmed. Melanie's voice trembled as she repeated, "So you're saying someone has been watching me? My family?" Darius met her eyes steadily. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying," he replied. "And the real question is, who?" A heavy silence settled over the room once again as everyone absorbed the enormity of the situation. Detective Nahr straightened up and spoke in a measured, serious tone. "All right, let's move inside. I want to assess the situation in greater detail." Darius did not argue. Instead, he led the officers into his home, his frustration simmering just below the surface as he endured being treated as a suspect in his own residence. Inside the house, Darius set his phone on the dining table and mirrored the router settings onto his laptop screen. The device list was displayed clearly, and once again, the mysterious Crestwood I-1 appeared. Still connected and still active. Officer Carter leaned in, scrutinizing the details. "Can you tell me what type of device this might be?" she asked once more. Darius's fingers danced over the keyboard as he navigated through various logs. "I can't tell exactly what it is," he admitted, "but look at these activity logs." His voice faltered as he continued scrolling, and his face turned ashen. "It's been accessing my security camera feeds," he repeated, his voice now laden with a mix of disbelief and fear. The room grew unbearably quiet. Melanie's eyes widened in alarm. "I don't understand," she murmured. "What do you mean by security camera feeds?" Darius slowly turned the laptop screen so that everyone could see. "My home security cameras have been compromised," he said, his voice steadying as he explained. "Someone has been logging in and watching my live feeds." Officer Carter's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. "So you're telling me that someone has been spying on you through your very own security system?" she asked, her tone laced with incredulity. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Darius confirmed, his voice growing even more intense. As he continued scrolling, his expression shifted from one of confusion to horror. "But it gets worse," he added quietly. "The more I look, the more I realize that it isn't just my cameras that have been hacked. My system has flagged multiple IP addresses. Some of them belong to my network, while others are linked to entirely different homes." A murmur of disbelief passed among those in the room. Detective Nahr leaned closer, his tone urgent. "What do you mean by other homes?" he demanded. Darius tapped on the screen once again, bringing up another log. "Look at this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Whoever is behind this isn't just watching me. They're watching other residents in the neighborhood as well." Melanie took an involuntary step back, her eyes wide with shock. No, that can't be right," she whispered, struggling to reconcile the reality of what she was seeing with her own understanding of her neighbors. Darius fixed her with a steady, unwavering gaze. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" he asked softly yet firmly. With a few more keystrokes, he opened yet another log. This time a new feed appeared on the screen. A dimly lit hallway, followed by a glimpse of a living room and then finally a bedroom. Melanie gasped once more. "Wait, "That's my house," she exclaimed, her voice barely audible as she pressed her hand to her mouth in shock. Detective Na's voice rang out sharply. "How on earth is this even possible?" His tone brooked no argument as he demanded an explanation. Darius gritted his teeth and took a deep breath before replying. "If I had to hazard a guess, it appears that someone in this neighborhood has set up a fake network, a seemingly legitimate Wi-Fi signal that people connect to without a second thought. Once connected, their devices become vulnerable, allowing the perpetrator to access and compromise their security systems." Officer Carter's eyes narrowed further as she considered the implications. "So, you're saying this is a classic man-in-the-middle attack?" she asked, her voice rising slightly in disbelief. "Exactly," Darius confirmed without hesitation. "That is precisely what is happening." Melanie's voice trembled as she repeated, "So, you're saying someone has been watching me, my family, and even other people in this neighborhood?" Darius met her gaze steadily and replied, "Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. And the more I dig into these logs, the more certain I become that the threat is not limited to just my own security breach." At that moment, Detective Na's face darkened with determination. "We need to figure out who is behind this, and we need to do it fast," he stated emphatically. Before anyone could respond, Detective Na pulled out his radio and called in for cybercrime support. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered to Officer Carter. "If someone is running a surveillance network like this, they're not merely invading privacy, they're committing a felony." Officer Carter nodded in solemn agreement. "If we don't stop them soon, who knows how far they've already gotten," she remarked, her voice heavy with concern. Darius, still seated at his laptop, was already delving deeper into the system's logs. Although he was not an expert hacker, he possessed enough knowledge of network security to trace where the data was being sent. His eyes widened as he discovered something startling. "Wait! This can't be right," he murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. Detective Na looked up from his own examination and asked, "What is it, Darius?" With trembling fingers, Darius turned the laptop screen so that both officers could see the new data. "It isn't being sent to some random distant server," he explained slowly. "It is in fact being sent to an address right here in our very own neighborhood." Melanie's eyes widened in shock. "You mean someone close by is responsible for this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Darius nodded grimly. "Yes, it appears that the data is coming from a house just a few doors down from mine." Detective Na's expression turned even more serious. "Can you pinpoint exactly which house?" he inquired. Darius worked quickly, cross-referring the connection timestamps with signal strength. Within minutes he had a match. His stomach dropped as he recognized the address immediately. Melanie too recognized it almost instantly. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Before Melanie could speak further, Darius cut her off in a tone that brooked no argument. "That's Brandon's house," he stated, his voice cold and measured. "Brandon, Foster, your nephew, Melanie. He's a 22-year-old college student who has been living with you for the past few months, quiet and reclusive, always on his computer, barely interacting with anyone, and now suddenly all of these disturbing pieces are starting to make a terrible amount of sense." Melanie's face went pale as she stuttered, No, that doesn't add up. Brandon isn't... Is he..." Before she could finish, Officer Carter interjected firmly. "We need to talk to him immediately." Melanie hesitated, torn between disbelief and a sinking certainty in her gut. I'll take you to him," she murmured softly. Darius stood as well, determination etched on his face. "I'm coming too," he insisted. Detective Na shot Darius a sharp look and said, "No, you stay here. Let us handle this." Darius clenched his jaw, knowing full well that he hated having to sit back while the investigation unfolded. "You'd better get the truth out of him," he muttered reluctantly, though the underlying tone was one of resigned acceptance. The truth, however, proved to be even more devastating than anyone had imagined. Melanie's hands trembled as she led Detective Na and Officer Carter down the street to Brandon's house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the impending confrontation was almost too much to bear. This was the nephew she had taken in, supported through school, and cared for deeply. It couldn't be him, she hoped desperately. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered, "What if it is?" Reaching Brandon's front door, Melanie called out tentatively, "Brandon?" "Can you come downstairs for a minute?" There was no response. Detective Nair exchanged a brief, concerned look with Officer Carter before stepping inside the house. "We're going upstairs," he stated firmly. Melanie did not argue. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself, her breath unsteady, and followed at a measured pace. They climbed the stairs until they reached the door to Brandon's bedroom. It was shut, and no sounds emanated from within. Detective Nair knocked hard, his voice commanding, "Brandon, this is the police. We need to talk." For several tense moments, there was only silence, until the sound of a chair scraping and some movement signaled that someone was there. Officer Carter's hand hovered near her gun as Detective Nair said, "Open the door slowly." The door creaked as the knob turned, revealing Brandon Foster. He looked startled and nervous, his eyes darting between Detective Nair, Officer Carter, and his Aunt Melanie. His hands fidgeted at his sides as he asked in a tight voice, "What is going on?" Detective Nair studied him carefully before saying, "We have reason to believe you have been accessing private security cameras in this neighborhood. Can you explain that?" Brandon's face barely registered any surprise. Instead, his fingers curled slightly, as though he was gripping something invisible. "That's crazy," he scoffed dismissively. I don't know what you're talking about." Officer Carter was not convinced. "Mind if we check your laptop?" she asked, her tone firm. "You don't have a warrant," Brandon protested, but Detective Nair stepped closer. "We can get a warrant," he replied, "but right now we're giving you a chance to tell us the truth before this situation deteriorates further." A long, tense silence ensued before Brandon finally exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. I wasn't doing anything illegal," he began weakly, only to be cut off by Detective Nair's impatient tone. "Then why is your IP address linked to a network breach that spans multiple homes?" Detective Nair demanded. Brandon froze, and Melanie's voice broke as she pleaded, "Please, Brandon, tell me you're not involved in this." For the first time, his carefully constructed mask of indifference faltered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It started out as a joke. I just wanted to see if I could get into someone's Wi-Fi, to mess with them." Detective Nair's voice grew sharp. "So you admit that you hacked into the network?" he said. Brandon hesitated, then nodded slowly, his expression one of resigned regret. Melanie's breath caught in her throat as Brandon continued, his voice quickening. "It was only supposed to be a harmless prank, but then I saw the security cameras and I got curious." Officer Carter's eyes narrowed. "Curious or obsessed?" she asked quietly. Brandon did not answer immediately. Detective Nair's patience was clearly wearing thin. "How many people have you been watching?" he demanded, his tone dropping to a grave murmur. "Silence," Brandon finally admitted, his voice trembling. I don't know." Melanie staggered back in shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. For the first time, Brandon looked at her with genuine remorse crossing his face. "I swear, I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," he said softly. Before he could finish, Detective Nair cut him off. "Brandon Foster, you are under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance." At this, Brandon went pale. "Wait, no!" he protested feebly. Officer Carter was already reaching for her cuffs. Melanie turned away, covering her face with her hands as tears welled in her eyes. In that moment, it was clear that Darius had been right all along, and the worst part was that Melanie had been the one to call the police on him, when the true danger had been hidden right within her own home the entire time. The situation, however, was far from over. Brandon did not resist as he stood there, his wrists now bound in cuffs, his eyes cast downward as Detective Nair read him his rights. The tension in the room was palpable. Melanie's breathing was shaky. She couldn't even bear to look at Brandon. This was her nephew, the very boy she had taken in, fed, supported and cared for, and he had been invading the privacy of their entire neighborhood. With a final heavy sigh, Detective Nair guided Brandon toward the door. But before he stepped out, he turned back to Darius, who had been watching silently from the sidewalk. "You were right," Detective Nair admitted gravely. "Had it not been for your vigilance, we might never have discovered any of this." Darius simply let out a slow, measured breath. After a moment of heavy silence, he spoke quietly but with unmistakable conviction. "You know what's truly crazy? I was just out here minding my own business, changing my own Wi-Fi password, and yet somehow I ended up being the one who got the cops called on me." Melanie flinched, her eyes wide with regret. "I was wrong," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I made an assumption, and it was completely unfair." Darius let that statement hang in the air for a few long moments before shaking his head slowly. "I don't need an apology," he said over his shoulder as he turned back toward his house. "Just do better next time." And with that, he disappeared inside. Detective Nahr and Officer Carter exchanged a final look before leading Brandon out toward the patrol car. Melanie remained behind, standing alone in the middle of the street as she grappled with the reality that the truth had been right in front of her all along. If only she had taken the time to observe more closely rather than jumping to conclusions. That mistake, she knew, would haunt her for a long, long time. It served as a stark reminder that assumptions have consequences. When we allow bias or paranoia to cloud our judgment, we risk ruining the lives of innocent people, all while the real danger goes unchecked. Instead of making snap judgments without solid evidence, it is far wiser to take a step back, observe carefully, and listen attentively. The truth might not always be what we expect it to be. If you found this story enlightening, please share it. You never know who might need to hear this important lesson today. As the day's events faded into a somber memory, the neighborhood of Crestwood was left to ponder the lessons learned from this extraordinary incident. The incident served as a powerful reminder that technology, while a useful tool, can also be manipulated to breach privacy and disrupt lives. It raised difficult questions about the balance between maintaining security and trusting our neighbors, and underscored the importance of vigilance in an increasingly interconnected world. For Darius, the experience was a jolt, a moment that shattered his previously quiet existence. He had simply been protecting his own network when he unwittingly exposed a far-reaching scheme. In the aftermath, as discussions about cybercrime and surveillance spread through Crestwood, Darius found himself reluctantly at the center of a community conversation about digital privacy and the responsibilities of living in a modern, interconnected society. Melanie, meanwhile, was left to reckon with her own assumptions. The weight of her misjudgment was a heavy burden to bear, especially as she realized that her impulsive actions had indirectly led to the unraveling of a deeply disturbing network of surveillance. In the months that followed, she became a fervent advocate for caution and the importance of gathering facts before acting on unfounded suspicions. Detective Nahr and Officer Carter, for their part, continued their work with renewed determination. The case had revealed vulnerabilities in the neighborhood's digital infrastructure, prompting local authorities to launch a broader investigation into cybercrime. Their experience served as a sobering reminder that even in a seemingly quiet suburb, high-tech threats could lurk behind familiar faces and well-kept facades. As the investigation unfolded further, neighbors began to speak up about unusual activity, and a community forum was established to discuss both the technological and social implications of the incident. The forum not only addressed the immediate concerns of digital privacy, but also fostered a dialogue about community trust and the need to bridge the gaps between neighbors in an era where isolation had become commonplace. Over time, Darius's experience became a cautionary tale. His quiet life, once free of the complications of modern technology, had been irrevocably altered by an unexpected intrusion into his personal space. Yet, even as he continued to maintain his distance from others, he found a renewed sense of purpose in advocating for better cybersecurity measures in the neighborhood. His story served as a powerful example of how even the most unassuming individuals could become inadvertent heroes when they stood up against intrusion and abuse. In the end, the entire episode, the mistaken assumptions, the technological breach, and the subsequent unraveling of a hidden surveillance network became a narrative about the modern dangers of complacency and the importance of clear evidence before making accusations. The cautionary tale resonated far beyond Crestwood, sparking conversations about the intersection of technology and privacy in communities across the country. And so, as the community slowly began to heal and rebuild trust among its members, the lessons of that fateful Thursday continued to echo in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed the unfolding drama. It was a reminder that in a world where technology could be used to hide sinister motives behind a veil of normalcy,